Okay, so you have your player moving around on the screen. The player is killing enemies and collecting stuff. But then you add a house to your world and might start to wonder, how on earth do I get the player inside this house? How do I get the scene to change in Godot? Hi everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of How to Make an Action RPG in Godot. In this episode, we will talk about how we can change scenes in Godot. And now let's get started. The first thing we need is of course a house the player can enter. In this tutorial, the house won't have any other functions or do anything spectacular, so I won't make a separate scene for it. Instead, I'm just creating it by adding a new layer for buildings in our tile map. And then I've added the houses from the Ninja Adventure asset pack to the tile set. I create a tile with one of the houses, and then add this to our tile map. I want the buildings to be a part of the Y sorting, so I also set the correct settings for this on the new buildings layer. Finally, I also want the player to collide with the house instead of just walking over and under everything. So I also want to set up a collision shape for the house tile. We can expand the editor for this using this button. Okay, so when we create the shape for the house, it's important to remember that we want the player to be able to walk through the door. So make sure you leave enough space for this in the collision shape. And finally, let's test the game and see how this works. This seems fine, but I can also see that I forgot to set the house Y sorting origin correctly. So I will just go fix that quickly. And then test everything again. Now, we also need a new scene that shows the insides of the house. So let's create a scene for this. My new scene just has a tile map with a new tile set for now. And the tile sets from the Ninja Adventure asset pack I'm using are tileset wall symbol, but in a slightly edited version, the one called tileset element, and the one called tileset interior floor. But you can of course use whatever you like. I put my edited version of the walls up on Edge with the rest of the additional art I've made or edited for these tutorials. The only thing I really did here was remove the background. My tile map for the inside of the house has two layers for now, a background and a layer with items that are Y sorted. Okay, now we have our house and the inside of the house. So, how do we get the scene to change? Well, there's a few ways of doing this. I will start with a naive solution at first, and then we move the solution into something a bit more complex. And yes, this will require us to change how the game fundamentally works in a few ways. So hold on and let's go. First, we want to know when the player enters the house. We want to create a trigger that starts the scene change. This is something that we could end up using in a lot of places in the game, so let's create a new scene for this. All this scene really needs is an area 2D, so this will be our root node. Now, we could just add a collision shape for it here as well, but these triggers might not all have the same shape in all cases, so we won't add that just yet. We will, however, add a script to the trigger. And then connect the Area2D's body intent signal to the script. Let's also give the script a class name. I'm naming it scene trigger. And then let's just add a breakpoint to the onBodyIntent function for now. Back in our world scene, we now want to add one of these triggers. We can do this by creating an instance from the scene file. This way the signals are still connected. And then let's move this trigger into the entrance of the house. Now, remember that we didn't add a collision shape to the trigger scene? Well, we need to handle this now, or the trigger won't work at all. Instead of adding it in the trigger scene, we can actually just add it as a child of the trigger instance right here. This will work just as well. And doing it this way now enables us to have a custom shape for each trigger. Okay, so let's make sure we've selected a shape that fits the entrance. I'm just using a rectangle shape here. It's the collision shape belonging to the player's character body 2D this trigger will be colliding with, and the trigger will go off just when the two touch. So this is why I make sure that the trigger's shape won't go all the way down to the bottom of the house. And now we can test and see what happens. We added a breakpoint to the scene trigger script earlier, which means that right now what we want is the game to pause when the player enters the trigger. But right now it does this right when we start the game. Why does this happen, you might wonder? Well, this is actually because the trigger collides with the tile map. Luckily, we can use the collision masks and layers to avoid this. First, we remove the scene trigger from all the collision layers. Then we reserve a new layer for the triggers and set the mask to this, so we only listen to bodies that are on this layer. Finally, we also need to go to the player scene and make sure its root node is also placed on this new trigger layer. And now we can test again, and everything should work as expected. Take your time to fine-tune the shape and position of the trigger so it fires exactly the time you want it to. All we need now is to make the scene trigger change the scene. To do this, we first add an exported string variable at the top of the scene trigger script. This should be the name of the scene we want to change to. We also add a string with the path to the scene files. Down in the onBodyIntent function, we then first create a string with the full path of the scene we want to change to. Next, we get the scene tree, and then we call the function changeSceneToFile on the tree with the path as input. Make sure you save, and then in our world scene, all we now need to do is add the name of the scene with the insides of our house to the trigger. And now, let's play the game and see what happens. Yay! Now we changed the scene. But we're also getting some errors here. What these errors tells us is that we shouldn't really be doing all this directly in a physics callback, and that we can fix this using call deferred instead. This will make Godot call the method at the end of the current frame instead of right away. So let's quickly go do that. Okay, so now we changed the scene. But this solution definitely isn't enough. Where is the player and the GUI? Well, we could just add an instance of the player and all the GUI items to our new inside the house scene. But even this wouldn't be enough, because we still need to transfer the state of the player to our new scene. So we need something that exists independently of what scene we currently have loaded. As I mentioned before, there's a few ways of handling this. In this video, we will solve the problem by creating and auto-loading a scene manager. Okay, so let's create a new scene for our scene manager. I'm just letting it extend from the node class, and then I'm giving it a class name. All we really want to transfer between scenes is the player. We should be able to just add the GUI items we want to the scene for the inside of the house, and it should then update correctly as long as our player is transferred. The scene manager will help us transfer the player, but it will also be responsible for changing the scenes. So again, we need a path to the folder where we keep our scenes stored. Finally, we create a function for changing scenes. This takes the old scene as input, as well as the name of the new scene. Before we change the scene, we first store the player from the old scene in our scene manager, and then we remove it from its parent. This step is important, because if the player is still in the scene tree of our old scene when we unload it, then it will be removed and destroyed with the rest of the scene. But this is what we're trying to avoid, remember? Just like we did in the scene trigger, we then create the full path for the new scene. And then use this to change the scene deferred. Now, to make the scene manager handle the scenes independently of what scene we have loaded, we first need to create an auto-loaded instance of it. We can do this from the project settings, and then auto-load. Here we find our scene manager script, and then we need to decide what our auto-loaded instance should be called. Then we click Add, and now we have an auto-loaded scene manager when our game starts. We also need to go to the scene trigger script and change this so it calls the change scene method on the scene manager instead of changing it itself. We can use the getOwner method to get the root of the scene it's a part of. And while we're here, let's also add a check so we only actually call this if the body entered is of the player class. We don't want some enemy or NPC accidentally changing the scene for us. To add the player to our inside house scene, we first create a script for the scene. And then in a ready method, we check if the scene manager has a player. And if this is the case, then we just add the player as a child. And now let's test and see what happens. Oh no, the player is in our new scene, but the scene itself is actually gone. Oh well, actually it is all there, but the player's global position is the same as it was in the old scene. So it just isn't near the tile map for the inside of the house. Now, we could just go change the player's global position in the script for this scene. But instead of constantly fixing little things again and again, I think it's time to take a step back and think more deeply about what we want to happen. And I know that some of you out there just feel that I should have started with the final solution right away. I've heard it before. However, this is the process we must go through when we develop a game. Or any kind of software, actually. We add things, we evaluate, we change things, and repeat. Okay, so the reason I want us to take a step back and think deeper before we just add stuff to one scene or the other is that changing scenes like this is something that will most likely happen a lot of places in our game. So we really need a solution where we don't have to implement the same things again and again in every single scene. All our base scenes will have this in common. They will have to get the player when they are loaded, and they will have to place the player correctly. In some cases, the player's position will even depend on where it came from. So now we're going to make a little mess, but it will be so rewarding once we are done, I promise you. What I want us to do now is create a script that all the scripts for our worlds or levels can inherit from. We could also solve our problem by making both a scene and a script that all our worlds or levels would inherit from. But for this video, I will only be using script inheritance. So let's create a new script for this. And give it a class name. We can set the player in the ready function. And there is a few cases we need to handle. First, we need to check if the scene manager actually has a player. Because of the way our scene manager works, it will only have a player once a scene change has happened. So for the scene we start in, this will be null. Okay, so if the scene manager has a player, then we need to get it. However, the current scene we're working on would probably also have another instance of the player, to make it easier to test while making the game. So at the top of our script, let's create an onReady variable for the scene's player. One thing we have to consider here is that now the player in all our scenes has to be a direct child of the scene's root node. But we will come back to this later. So to make sure our player is the one from the scene manager, we first have to free the one in our scene, if there is one. And then we set our player and add it as a child of the scene. Before moving on, I would like to make sure that everything still works as expected if we use our new script. So in the script for our first world scene, let's make this inherit from our new base scene script. We can also now remove the variable with the player, since this will already be in the script we inherit from. And now we need to get back to where the player is in the scene tree, because right now, in this scene, it's a child of our tile map. But the script requires it to be a child of the root node. So let's start by moving it in the scene tree so this is the case. But now we would end up with problems with our Y sorting, since this is currently only enabled for children of the tile map. So we also need to enable Y sorting on the root node for this solution to work. And well, we have one more issue. Our follow camera. Currently, the follow camera is a child of the player. And when we move the player to a new scene, it will take all its children with it, including the camera. But I'm not sure I want the same kind of camera for all scenes. So I don't really want the camera to be transferred with the player. To fix this, we also need to have the camera created a bit differently. First of all, it should also be a direct child of the root. And then in the camera script, we then add an exported variable for the player. In the physics process function, we then set the camera's global position to be the global position of the player. This will work the same as the solution where the camera was a direct child of the player. And finally, we of course select the camera and add the player in the inspector menu. Now, the camera will work as always when we test this specific scene. However, if we load the scene and change the player, the camera won't know who to follow. So in our world script, we need to both run the inherited ready function to set the player from the scene manager, but we also need to set the player to the camera. To do this, we first call super. This calls the inherited function. And then we set the camera's follow node to be the player. Since we don't really do anything in the script for the inside of the house, we can just remove the script that was attached and then attach the new base scene script directly instead. Oh, this was way too many changes to do without any testing. So now, let's test and see how it all works. Okay. Almost everything seems to still be working as expected. Only now it looks like the player isn't inside the house. It is, however, but now that we've removed the follow cam from the player in the first scene, it isn't transferred with the player, and thus it isn't in the new scene for inside the house, which is what we want. So we just can't see the player. This is what we'll be fixing now. Whenever we change scenes, we want our new scene to have a marker that tells us where we should place the player. For some scenes, like the inside of the house here, there will only be one marker. And for others, like the world scene, there may be many entrance markers. To make it easier to find the markers in our script, we will be storing them as children of a single node 2D. All this node really does is act like a folder for the entrance markers. So let's go back to the script for our base scene and add a new onReady variable for the entrance markers. Again, remember that this means that all the scenes that inherit from base scene should now have this node, or we will get an error when we run the game. So let's quickly go add a node 2D and give it the correct name to both our scenes. If you think this seems a bit tedious to add for each of the scenes that inherit from our base scene, then you aren't the only one. And as mentioned before, we could also create a new scene that has all these things and then create inherited scenes for the world, inside the house, and so on. Just like we did with the collectibles so many tutorials ago. But I will leave that as something you can experiment with on your own. Okay, now in our scene for inside the house, let's add a marker 2D as the child of the entrance markers node. And place it where we want the player to be positioned when the scene is loaded. Let's also give it a name. For now, I'm calling mine Any. This is meant to tell us what scene the player should come from to be placed here. Back in our base scene script, we are now ready to position the player. To do this, we create a new method called positionPlayer. And then call this from the ready method. In our new method, we then go through each of the children of the entrance markers node and check if the name of the current entrance is Any. And if this is the case, we then set the player's global position to be the global position of the found entrance. And now let's test again and see how this works. Yes! Finally, we changed the scene and placed the player correctly. Oh, this feels so good. But maybe you also want to be able to leave the room? Well, now we already have all the parts to make this happen. And I think you should be able to maybe do this all on your own, but we'll quickly go through it. Inside the house, we need to place a scene trigger and set the connected scene to be the world. And then in our world, we place a marker 2D as the child of the entrance marker node and name it any. And then let's see what happens. And now I really just have one single trick to show you before we're done. As mentioned before, some scenes might have multiple entrance markers, so we need to know which one to choose. For this, I first go to the scene manager and add a string variable to store the name of the last scene. And then set this when we change the scene. In our base scene script, when we position the player, we then first get the name of the last scene and check if this is empty. If this is the case, then we just set it to any. And down here, when we check the name of the entrance, we then check if the name is either the same as the last scene name or any, before setting the player's position. And now let's go to our world scene and rename the entrance marker we have so it's called the same as the name of our inside the house scene. This should match the name of the root node. We can now test again and see that this works perfectly also. Note that the names really have to match here. What I've done in my version is add a few little things to make it easier to avoid problems. I make both strings we compare lowercase. And I also remove all underscores and spaces from both strings. This way, everything will still work correctly even if I forget how I usually specify these names. Just remember that now you also can't have scene names called almost the same with only underscores, spaces, or upper lowercase differences, which you really shouldn't have anyways. Wow, this ended up being such a long video. Congratulations if you made it all the way through. If you're wondering about the error we're getting here, it's just because I haven't added an instance of the player to the inside of the house. Do this and the error goes away. And now, please remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment and all that if you like this video and want to see more like this in the future.